Hey folks, welcome to week 10 of Visual Design. How is everybody? I hope you're doing well and taking care of yourself. This week we are going to continue along with Adobe Illustrator, exploring what it can do in terms of shape creation, editing, and setting up a page. So we're going to take care of that today. You'll be able to work on it all week, and we're going to introduce you to your next project that you guys are going to work on this week. So let's get rolling, huh? All right, so let's take a look at the syllabus. So over here in week 10, we are working on Illustrator, and the topic this week is a selection of a different sort. Now, if you remember, back in Photoshop, we spent a lot of time on the selection tools. Remember the marching ants and how you could lasso things and draw things and put rectangles around things. And this way you could sort of control large groups of pixels. Well, as you saw last week with Illustrator, the items we're working with on the screen are sort of actual digital objects. You make a rectangle, it's a rectangle. You make a square, it's a square, and you can treat it as such. So because of that, the way we handle selections in Illustrator is of course different than we do in Photoshop. So we're going to talk a little bit more about working with some existing shapes now that we've made some shapes last week, how to work with bounding boxes a little bit further, what anchor points do specifically, and we're going to talk about merging shapes together, cutting them apart, and using some other tools, as well as diving a little bit further into strokes and colors. So let's get rolling with that. All right, and we'll come back and take a look at what our project is. Now, normally this week we would have met March 31st and April 2nd. Of course, you guys are working all week on this stuff. Hopefully you've been taking lots of time to work and practice with Illustrator. Also, beyond what we're about to do now in Illustrator, remember that there is an announcement posted for week 10, which is right here. Announcements, go down to the week 10 more intro to Illustrator, and there are 3 links here: creating and editing shapes, which we covered last week, but this is a different way to look at it; transform and edit artwork; change color and strokes. So just some more reminders on these subjects. Now these links will take you to Adobe's website, specifically where they have some tutorials on creating and editing shapes, drawing simple shapes, creating lines, so on and so forth. These are really fun and easy. This one here is on transforming and editing artwork, some really great stuff to work with. And this one also on the Adobe website is changing color and stroke. So be sure to look at those as well. It'll give you a different perspective on the stuff that we are covering here. Okay, so let's dive back into Illustrator and pick up where we left off. So back over here in Illustrator, I have a collection of shapes that I've already created, similar to the ones we looked at last week. We've got a square, we've got a rectangle, a circle, an ellipse, and a couple, we've got a polygon and a triangle, which of course is just a polygon with 3 sides, and we've got a few different stars. You'll see that I have the ruler turned on and I have the grid turned on. All of these are useful tools in terms of working with your page. So we're going to dive a little deeper into what to do with these shapes and how to affect them. Okay, so first things first, I am going to zoom in a little bit here and take a closer look at the square. Okay, so in looking at the square, remember you always go back to your black selection arrow, right? That is always your starting and your ending point for pretty much everything you do in Illustrator. And if I click on the square, you'll see that the bounding box appears. Now you remember this from last time, that I can rotate the object, right? I can scale the object using the bounding box. I can obviously move it simply by picking it up and relocating it, and of course I can round corners by pulling down on those circles. And of course with the square selected, or any object selected, the properties palette sort of comes to life and hands you a bunch of tools that it thinks you're going to need to operate with the square or whatever item you have selected. And so you can make all sorts of alterations here in terms of rotating at specific angles, changing the width or the height to specific measurements, flipping the object vertically or horizontally, changing the fill color, changing the stroke color, changing the makeup of the stroke by turning it into a dashed line or rounding the corners or whatnot, changing the width of the stroke over here, and then adjusting the opacity of the actual item, making it more or less opaque, and even applying blending modes like we had in Photoshop. So we covered all this last week. Be sure and make sure you've been practicing with those items. Now there's some other things to pay attention to as well. Now let's look a little closer at the square, and of course the things I'm showing you here in the square apply to all shapes, but I just wanted to start here, okay? So remember, the bounding box is made up of multiple items. This blue line that you can sort of see here is the frame that creates the shape, meaning that the fill color and the stroke color are simply decoration, as it were. The shape exists with or without the colors. Now, this is not something you can say about Photoshop. Once the pixels are deleted in Photoshop or removed, they're gone. There's nothing else there. Here, however, this square or any shape will exist with or without color. How do I know that? Well, let me show you. So with the square chosen, I'm going to go over here to the bottom of the toolbox where the color picker is. And there's a few buttons at the bottom of the color picker. And remember, of course, this is the fill color rather, that's the stroke color. And the last button is that sort of universal symbol for none, that red slash that means none or no. So with the fill color on top, if I click that, I remove the fill color. And now, of course, my square is completely see-through. I can see the grid behind it. It's transparent. But it still has the black stroke. Now if I choose the stroke color, you can see that that now comes on top, so it's the active color. If I click the universal symbol for no here, that goes away. And so you would think, oh, the square's gone, right? But no, it's not. If I use my black selection arrow and just click in some dead space, it looks as though the square has disappeared. But if I just were to click and lasso where the area where I knew the square was and let go, look, there it is. So this is the bounding box without any color applied to it. No fill color, no stroke color. The square still exists, whether you have a color applied to it or not. Now I'm doing this not only to show you that the shapes exist with or without color, but also to show you the mechanics of the bounding box a little more clearly. So let's take a look at those. Okay, so again, this blue line is referred to as a path, and you can see if I hover over it, the little word path pops up. The path is essentially the wireframe that creates the shape. These squares that are on all four sides as well as all four corners of the box are known as anchor points. We talked about that last time. And of course, if I hover over any of the anchor points, that allows me to resize the shape by clicking and dragging it either from a side or from a corner. And I can do that either loosely by just clicking and dragging and turning it into any shape that I want, or if I hold down the shift key, it will maintain its proportion but only get larger or smaller, so it'll remain a square. Okay, other things in the bounding box that are important. These circles here are the corner rounds. Again, those allow you to round the corners. We talked about that. Also, you'll notice that there is a center point. Now this sometimes we don't see because there's a color here and it kind of blends in. But the center point allows you to pick up and move the object, but the center point also comes in handy when we get to some of these other tools in a second. Okay, let's see what some of these other tools do. So the anchor points, whether you have the object selected or you have it unselected, those anchor points are still there. And I know that because I can hover over them without clicking, and you'll see that it sort of magically appears. You'll see the word anchor popped in the upper left corner. So those anchor points, of course, are still there. They're still active. They're just sort of invisible when the object is unselected. Now that's important to know because the other arrow that we have adjacent to our black selection arrow is known as the direct select tool. What that tool allows you to do is to manipulate the anchor points in a way that allows you to change the shape of the shape. What do I mean by that? I'll demonstrate. Okay, so again, I know the anchor point is right here, right? Because I remember it being there. Now I'm going to apply some color back to my square here, just so it's easier to see, but I just want you to understand that even without color, this framework of the bounding box still exists on all shapes, okay? So let's go back and add some color to the square. I'll just give it a red fill. And I'm not going to bother putting a stroke on it just because it'll be easier to see the bounding box. Okay, so now with the black selection arrow, I'm going to deselect, and there's my rectangle. It's still there. But I'm going to switch over to the direct select tool, and watch what happens when I hover over where an anchor point is. You'll see that the anchor point kind of lights up. And if I then click on it, I can now just move that anchor point, but not move the square. So you'll see that I can turn my square into an entirely different shape simply by moving that anchor point. Once I let go of it, it now becomes that. So do you see what I did? So imagine that your shape is basically a collection of wires that are held together with pins that are punched into a pin board. And now if I go over with the direct selection tool and pick up one of those pins, I can move it somewhere else on the board, and thus the wires will move with me. And so I can change the shape simply by doing that. And it doesn't just work with one anchor, it works with any anchor. So I can do that too. And now I'm making an entirely new shape just by picking up these anchor points and moving them around. And then of course if I were to go back and add a fill to it, you'll see that it becomes that new shape. Now think about what that does. That essentially allows you complete malleability of any shape simply by moving the anchor points around. So just to go backwards in time here, again we start out with a rectangle and we add a fill to it, and just as a normal shape, all I've got to do is when I deselect it, grab the direct selection tool, pick up any of the anchors, we'll move over and grab this guy, and I can redistribute the way the shape looks. Pretty great, right? Now, one little tricky thing about the direct selection tool is that if you have selected the object with your black selection arrow, the direct selection tool then does not work. You'll see that it just moves the shape. I know, that's a little bit of a weird glitch that Illustrator has. It doesn't seem to make any sense why it would do that. But the truth is that the object has to be deselected, so meaning click with your black selection arrow anywhere to deselect the object. Then you have to grab the direct selection tool. Then you hover over where you think there's an anchor, and then you can manipulate the shape. I know that's a bit of a bug, but it's been like that in Illustrator forever. Okay, so that's the direct selection tool. Allows you to move things around at will. Now, what if I wanted to have more anchor points? Right, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 anchor points on a square, right? 4 corners, 4 sides. What if I wanted another anchor point because I wanted to really truly change the shape a different way? So underneath the selection arrow is the pen tool. Now later on next week we're going to get into how to draw with the pen tool, but for now if we hold down the pen tool, you'll see that there is other pen tools living underneath the main pen tool. There's a thing called an anchor point tool, which we'll talk about when we are doing some drawing. But there's the add anchor point tool and of course the delete anchor point tool. Both of these do exactly what they say they do. They add or subtract anchor points. So to use them, you simply grab the add anchor point tool, make sure that your object is already selected. See, it's active. I can see the bounding box. And then if you click anywhere on a path, I can add an anchor point. And then I will add another one over here, and I will add another one over here. Now I'm going to go back to my direct selection tool, and just so you can see it better, I'm going to remove the fill. And now you can see that there are multiple anchors here. And so what that means is that if I grab the direct selection tool, I can hover over, there's that new anchor I created. I can click and move that one, as well as any of the other ones. And there's another new one that I made, and another new one that I made. So I don't have just the 8 anchor points that were originally on the square. I've added 3 more, so now I have 11 anchor points that are making up this particular shape. And I can do it at any point in time. If I want to add more, I can grab the add anchor point tool, add another one, and then grab my direct selection tool and do that. Grab another add anchor point, boom, add that one there, grab the direct select, do that. So I can do this all day. I can turn that square into pretty much anything I want. Now let's say I've gone too far and I've added too many anchor points. Well, as you can probably imagine, the delete anchor point tool does exactly what it says it does. I can go over here and hover over an anchor point and click it, and it deletes it, and then we'll redraw the shape without that anchor point. So I'll get rid of this one, and then this one, and so on and so forth. So you can really kind of change the shape however you want. Now if you think about this, this allows you to sort of start creating recognizable objects. based on basic shapes. Now there's a theory in drawing that pretty much everything is made up of simple shapes: squares, rectangles, circles, ellipses, triangles, etc. If you look at any object in the world, they're made up of a collection of shapes kind of glued together a certain way, right? Go look at a car or a house or whatever, and you'll see that there are very recognizable shapes if you break it down into such. And so that way you can basically turn basic shapes into new things. Okay, so that is the direct selection tool, as well as the add and subtract anchor point tool, which lives underneath the pen tool. Okay, so that is something we can play around with. Now, what else can we do here? Let's look at some other possibilities. So back to our collection of shapes here. You'll see that we have all these other shapes. Now, this one you already know because we did it in Photoshop, but I want to show you why it's really useful here in Illustrator, and that is the universal keyboard command for duplicate, right? So let's see, here I have a triangle. So if I click it once with my selection arrow, it becomes active. I can see the bounding box. But if I hold down the Option key on the keyboard, you'll see that it becomes a double arrow, right? And now that allows me to click and drag it and create a duplicate. And I can do this multiple times and keep making duplicates of it. So now I have multiples of the same shape. Each one works independently. So if I wanted to change the color of any of them, I can do that easily enough. Now, of course, another thing to pay attention to is how you drag them. If I were to pick up an object, right, and just move it, I can move it loosely anywhere I want, right? It's completely free. But if I were to hold down the Shift key while I'm dragging the object, so first you start dragging it and then you hold down the Shift key, it basically forces it to stay in a straight line. I can only drag it horizontally. Or if I were going upwards and hold down the Shift key, I can only drag it perfectly vertically. So it locks it into an axis, right? Now that same system works for duplicating. If I choose that triangle, hold down the Option key to duplicate, as I drag, if I hold down the Shift key at the same time, it keeps it perfectly in line with the previous triangle. And again, keep doing that. So now I've got them all lined up nicely. So that's duplicate, and of course that works for everything. Now that one shouldn't come as too much of a surprise to you because we did use this keyboard command in Photoshop and it works in a variety of places, but it's a super useful tool. Okay, let's talk about alignment. Okay, so let's say, for example, I have, I'm going to make some duplicates here and bring them over to the right side so that we can play around with them a little bit. So I'm going to duplicate my circle, and I'm going to duplicate this polygon, and I am going to duplicate this star, and we will duplicate this triangle here, but I'm actually going to shrink them down a little bit so he's a more regular sized triangle. Okay, so here I have four shapes: circle, polygon, star, and triangle, and they're kind of just willy-nilly stuck over here. But what if I wanted to line them up, right? Now I could manually line them up using the Smart Guide. You see those purple guidelines that keep popping up. So if I wanted to pick up the next shape and line it up using those tools, I could do that. And you can see that it also gives me some distance measurements by doing that. And that's certainly useful, but it's also a little more time consuming. What if I just wanted to sort of line them up automatically? Well, over here in the Properties palette, there are some solutions. First, though, you have to lasso all of the objects that you wish to line up. So I'm just going to click out here in some dead space with my selection arrow and lasso these guys. And then you'll see here that the Properties palette gives me some new tools. Right down here is Align. And if you hover over each one, it tells you how it's aligning it, right? So if I wanted to align it vertically along its center line, simply click that and watch what happens. Boom. It lines them up nice and neat. How great is that, right? Now, furthermore, if I wanted to distribute them, down in the bottom of the Align section, there's three little dots. That gives me more options. You'll see here that there's a distribution section, which allows me to spread them out evenly. And again, you can hover over each one and play around with them to see how they work. But if I want to distribute them based on their centers, I do that. And you'll see that those middle guys just kind of shifted over a little bit. So now, not only are they lined up nicely in the center, but they're evenly laid out. So that is the align and distribute section. I'll demonstrate it again, just using some circles. So again, if I had a bunch of circles, and I'm gonna put these kind of all over the place so they're a total mess. And then if I lasso all of them, go over here to the properties palette, I can boom, line them up, and then go to distribute and boom, distribute them so that they're evenly distributed. Boom, 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 boom. And if I were to take one of them and move it way out here, and then do it again and distribute them, right? It now adjusts for the extra distance. So that is align and distribute. Pretty great, right? Okay, so we are going to stop right here, and then I will come back with another video to go over some more features.